Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and today my guest is Anthony, the man with a million nicknames.
It's true. I don't actually know. I guess that counts as a nickname. Thank you so much for having me here. I've really been enjoying listening to your podcast since you started. You've had some really excellent guests, and I'm really glad to be able to join the ranks.
Oh no, I'm so thrilled to have you here. And folks will know you, Anthony, from your work on the regular cube, the irregular cube, the turbo cube, many other projects, and also this tiny project that you've had going for a little while called Lucky Paper.
Yeah, it's crazy that it's been going on for as long as it did. I was actually really surprised. I was, responding to somebody on Blue Sky or whatever the new Twitter of the day is, and I was like, "Oh yeah, we've been doing a podcast for let me do some quick math, 4 years." That was a little bit of a shock, but yeah, we've been doing the podcast for a while and the website for a little bit longer. And if you don't know, we mostly talk about Cube, but just sort of magic in general. Andy and I do, and then on the website we do set reviews with feedback from the community as well as just articles about whatever magic topics we're interested in. So, it's not a commercial thing in any way. It's purely just a hobby thing from a couple of us nerds that are really, really into magic and sort of these kind of like sandbox formats of magic. So that's been a project we've been doing for a long time.
That's something that I've found really amazing, that Lucky Paper has been a passion project all the way through. I think I've heard other people talk about similar projects. Like I got to talk to Gwen recently about Cube Cobra, and how it's the sort of thing that it's not something that arguably there's a lot of money in, that it's something you just really have to care about and want to pursue. And the fact that you all have been cranking along for so long is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it's just a hobby project. It's for fun, and it's going to be different for different people in different contexts. A lot of people, that's not practical just to dump a bunch of your time without being able to support it in some way. And for Cube Cobra, it's a totally different equation because it takes a lot of money to run that site. So we've been
Yes.
very deliberate about the projects we've taken on are all things that we can just host in a way that ends up being really, really inexpensive. So that means we can just kind of build stuff that will last for a while without us putting a lot of maintenance into them.
It always reminds me of the meme about software that exists because of the one person maintaining a private server in, I forget the state. But the meme with like the tower
Yeah,
of
yeah,
things that exist.
exactly.
And I feel like a number of the tools that you guys curate and produce are the sorts of things that maintain how a lot of people engage with Cube in the digital space.
That's terrifying. I've actually heard Gwen say the same thing about Cube Cobra and how at some point he realized that some other people had built bricks on top of his brick, and he used to just think that was, Scryfall down at the bottom, and he was one of the pieces on top. And suddenly it feels a little bit more intimidating to actually have things built on top. But yeah, I mean, I have done a lot of little things that are hopefully not super critical to people's workflows, but I am very interested in using my, abilities as a software developer to be able to make things that make their workflows easier. Just because I hate seeing people do repetitive tasks on computers.
You just want to do the one task one time and let the computer do the repetitive part.
Exactly, exactly. There's an XKCD for everything. Another one of my favorites is that comparison of, how much time do you spend on a thing, on automating something before you actually save any time. And I
Yeah.
know I've definitely been on the losing end of that many, many times, and that just makes it so satisfying when somebody's like, "Oh, I've been using your list formatter or your list differ, and it like saved me so much time on this task." And I'm like, "Yes, that graph is twisting a little bit in the right direction in my favor."
Let's talk a little bit about a few of those tools, because these are things that either people may not be aware of, or they may have seen them and not realize that this is something that you have a direct and active hand in. You've helped put together some big tools that people use, like the cube map, for example. You just mentioned the list formatter and the list differ. Those are more recent projects, as I recall.
The cube map actually just comes from Jet Crowdis, who is one of the other founding members of Lucky Paper, the website, years before we actually had a podcast. And he was just really interested in data analysis and using this tool that often gets used in, for example, biomedical field to try and cluster gene sequencing data to try and understand the way that genes relate to each other and things like that. But he was like, well, we could actually just apply this to cube lists as well, because they are also similarly kind of these sets of data that have some patterns in them that are maybe a little bit difficult to see, but this algorithm can reveal these kinds of clusters and groupings that end up becoming interesting and meaningful, even if they aren't the kind of groupings that people would naturally come to if you're just sort of going top down and trying to name things. So that was a really interesting project because it was this huge data set. We did work with Gwen to get all the Cube Cobra data, run it through this algorithm, do a lot of tweaking of the parameters to make everything work. And then my job was to take that resulting data set, this actual two-dimensional map of how do all the cubes sort of get grouped by this algorithm and make that into something that we can actually look at on a website. And my first thought was, I don't know if we can really do this. This is a lot of data. Like, we're going to start having performance issues really quickly. And had a couple sort of, I mean, this is honestly one of my just most favorite experiences that I get to experience a lot through Magic and through these sort of peripheral experiences about how Magic ties to other things, is this experience of learning and how so often you struggle with something and you're trying to figure out, how do I do this and that, and it just doesn't make sense. And then you go to sleep and you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, of course, here's the answer. Like, I slept on it and my brain just figured it out and now I can't unsee it. And I remember with the cube map had a couple realizations about, well, I just have to rethink the way I'm presenting this data or organizing this data, and we can make it work.
I was going to just give the little bit of context, because what you're doing is taking functionally X thousand dimensional information and condensing it into something two dimensional, and then trying to make that proximity translate into something.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can almost think about it like you're projecting a shadow, where you're losing some information, but you kind of get the profile of something, which gives you a different perspective on it. But you're not seeing a two-dimensional shadow of a three-dimensional object. You're seeing a two-dimensional shadow of a 20,000 dimensional object.
Excellent. Okay, so you've gathered these epiphanies in your sleep, and then
And then it worked. That was really satisfying. I mean, even more so than Jet wanted to do the same thing with all the data from EDHREC, which was not 80,000 cubes. It was, I think it was like 1.5 million cubes or something, if I'm remembering.
oh my
And I was
goodness.
like, no way. Like, I'm already having trouble getting the website to work reliably with this amount of data. That's like out of the question. And then again, I sort of had this in the back burner of my mind for a while. And eventually I thought, okay, what if I mean, if we want to be really specific, what if I do this using GLSL and use WebGL shaders in order to actually render this data rather than trying to use Canvas or SVG? Somebody's going to be interested in this, so I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail.
No, that's totally fine.
Um,
We'll catch up with you in a moment.
and then be able to, like, okay, I'll take this data set, upload it all to the shader in one batch, and then I just need to update this one transformation matrix in order to actually allow you to zoom in and scroll around. And, there were just a lot of these sort of learning moments that felt really, really exciting. And having something that at the end of the day was just presenting a ton of data, but you could actually explore in a really smooth user interface was really, really satisfying.
I remember that was one of my earliest interactions with Lucky Paper as the website. I remember using that resource to try to find things that were similar to a project I was working on. And you're able to see some things that have a significant overlap, perhaps in cards or in themes or something like that. I could see where that would be a little more tricky in, I mean, certainly a multi-million set of data, but for something like EDHREC, where it's like every Thalys commander is going to look some degree of similar, I would imagine. But every cube that includes a lightning bolt could look wildly different.
That's absolutely true. And I actually find for that reason, the cube map to be much more interesting to explore than the commander map. Not just because I'm more interested in cube in general, but it is much more, it looks kind of like what you expect when you look at the commander map. It's like things are kind of organized by the commander because people that are playing a specific commander have a really strong incentive to include similar cards. There are definitely going to be some exceptions, and you'll see some clusters that are sort of, this is the Tron commanders, or this is the commanders that all care about equipment, or this is the commanders that care about +1/+1 counters, will sort of form these super clusters. But on the cube map, so many of those things are much more nuanced. And it's like, here's Old Border, but then there's a whole bunch of different clusters within Old Border of specifically Urza's block, or Old Border, but includes new printings of, or newly old bordered cards and things like that. So there's just so much complexity to the types of groupings that you see.
And I think one of the most valuable setups there is that you can then follow the link of each point of data to the cube that it represents. So it's not just like, here's a signpost. It's like, here, you can actually go learn. Like, you can actually go find out what the critical piece is.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many fun ways to use it. Like you mentioned, you're just looking for inspiration about a certain cube, or you want to find what people that are doing similar things to you are doing. Those use cases in the actual interface for it are a little bit tricky to explain, though. It's not just like, oh, yeah, you want to do X, go do X right here. It's like, here's this thing to explore, go have fun with it, and you're going to find a couple interesting facets, which is different from, so I mentioned a lot of these other smaller projects were really driven just by solving my own needs. So for example, the List Differ, which is a pretty small little web app, which is on the Lucky Paper site. If you go to the resources page, you can find it. But it just came up so much in my playing Magic as a hobby that I have two lists of cards and I want to compare them. whether that's I have my cube and your cube, and I want to be able to look at them and take the particular what cards are unique in one and export that somewhere else, or I have two versions of my cube and I want to know which cards are different so that I can add those to my cart on TCG Player or whatever. It's just a thing that comes up all the time. And I would often just, open up the JavaScript console and do a little scripting because that's a pretty easy thing to do when you have that ability. But for a lot of people, just grabbing your JavaScript console is not necessarily the most comfortable thing. So
Yeah,
I wanted
yeah.
to make a little page that would do that for you much quicker. And similar with the list formatter, I just had all these similar cases. The key one that kind of started with it was I very often wanted to do a search on Scryfall and then be able to export that as a text list to, again, maybe I want to put that into a site to order some cards, or more likely I want to add those to a list on CubeCobra, or add them to a deck, or I just want to save it so I can compare it to something else down the road. And that was not trivial to do on Scryfall itself, but with their API is pretty easy. So I started with that need of just, can I go from a Scryfall search to a list of text names, and then have sort of slowly added more features like I want to be able to export it into a CSV and configure which specific columns I have in my CSV and include the mana cost and the color or the price, or I want to get all the images or just the art crop images. So it's really just about being this Swiss Army knife for if you have lists of cards or a search for a card or a link to a list of cards on CubeCobra, you can transform that into whatever other kind of data set you want without having to actually know how to write JavaScript.
Do you think that having a platform like the Lucky Paper website led to you wanting to create this in a way that you can share with other people?
Yeah, absolutely. Just having some centralized place where I can just be like, I want to tinker on this little tool and then publish it somewhere and then I can link to it definitely makes it a lot, much easier than having to, think about, do I want to buy a domain for this and how am I going to host this? It's like that, the boring stuff is kind of taken care of to some degree. And I mean, even to the point where I've kind of slowly built up a library of here are my components for buttons and toggles and selects and modals, and I have kind of built up my own little user interface library that I've been recycling for some of these tools.
Well, we've seen a little bit of a spike in people working on their own projects for accessibility and analysis for cubes here recently. But I can see where a lot of those would be kind of like you described, something that you would do on your own for yourself, and then it kind of disappears into your own library. Was there anything that like inspired you to want to share that in that way?
A big part of it is legitimately just that I get frustrated when I see other people doing repetitive tasks on the computer. Like, literally, oh, I want to add these cards to this other system, but I need to write a one before every card so that it actually accepts it because it needs the count. And I'm like, I can write you a script that does that in 30 seconds, and I can build you an interface that'll let you do it in 2 weeks or whatever, however much time I've spent in these cumulative. So that's a big aspect, and just being able to, yeah, I mean, help people cut down on the grudge work and just make Magic more fun. And yeah, like you mentioned, it's been kind of an explosion. I think there is for good reason, and it's not surprising to see that in the Cube community specifically, is that there's this intersection of people that are both pretty technical, pretty savvy into learning the nitty gritty of systems, and are also pretty creative and collaborative. And that just has created this environment where a lot of people, especially in the Cube Talk Discord, are just building things because they want to see their cube analyzed a certain way, and then it ends up being super useful and insightful for other cube designers.
How do you manage building things for fun, like for yourself, and building it as a project you feel obligated to complete?
That's a great question. It is honestly difficult, and the fact that I do web design also professionally means that I will very often spend a day working on building websites, and then at the end at 5 o'clock it's like, yeah, I've got a couple hours here I could spend on a project, but I cannot look at JavaScript anymore. That's just, there's just no more in the tank today. And I think that it's helped a lot for me to just sort of be aware of that limitation, that there is this resource. Maybe we should say that I have a certain number of spoons to work on JavaScript in a day. And so, for example, I'd been trying to work on this article and this analysis about shuffling cubes for literally multiple years. And I saw that, okay, I'm going to take a week off for the holidays, go spend some time with family. I'm also going to make sure I spend a couple hours every day and work on this and sort of get this across the finish line, because it's going to be really hard for me to finish that during a normal work week.
I wanted to mention one of the other tools that you've put together that I've used a couple of times. You also put together a rotisserie draft template, which, while maybe not software that's been written necessarily, it's a
Oh no,
tool that.
there's some software in there. If you open up the JavaScript
Oh, no, see, no, this shows my ignorance on a lot of that because I opened it up and like, oh, this is Google Sheets or whatever. Like that just strikes me as something very different.
It is Google Sheets, and honestly, so the a rotisserie draft, for a little bit of context, is just a face-up information draft where everybody sort of goes around the table and picks cards one at a time. And one of the great things about it is you can do it asynchronously through a spreadsheet. Like that's really all you need is like everybody put in the card they want in the next cell and then message the next person.
And
Um,
Anthony, I want to say you are a master at bringing people in and defining these things along the way. So thank you for being on top of that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's easy to get lost in the sauce, and I think I already have a couple times this episode, so gonna try and be mindful of that. But it was just this thing where we were doing rotisserie drafts pretty regularly, especially, during lockdown. It was just a way that we could keep playing Magic with a group. And we started with a very basic spreadsheet that was just, here's 8 columns of people, 42 rows for the cards, and we'll copy paste the list of the cards into another sheet so you can reference it. And then every time we would do a draft, I would add one or two more little features, whether it was initially saying, well, we're going to autocomplete. So when you start typing in your card in the draft sheet, it'll fill in the name of the cards from the cube list. And then let's actually check off those cards as you go. So you can see on the cube list what's already been taken. And then it's gone a little bit wild where I've even added configuration for you just put in the URL for the cube and it'll automatically go fetch it from Cube Cobra and fill it in. And then if you want to alter the number of players or how many picks you're doing, it actually goes through and updates all the cells to modify little arrows to sort of give you hints about the pick order and stuff like that. So it wasn't a all at once kind of project. It was every time we do a draft, I'm going to improve this a little bit. And then it got to the point where it was pretty easy to sort of abstract that and share it with people such that it's a pretty easy sheet to use where you, again, just plug in the URL, plug in the name of your players. It fills in the cube, randomizes the players, and does pretty much everything you need.
That has to be so satisfying to see something go from a kernel of an idea to really a full executable from anybody on almost any computer.
It's satisfying, but it's more sort of this like chain of eroding frustrations where it's like, well, it took me a little bit longer than I wanted to be able to get the cube list into the spreadsheet. Let me just make that easier. And so it's sort of funny that at the end of the day, I mean, this is kind of a perennial thing that I feel with software development and honestly with just doing lots of creative projects that the better you do, the less noticeable it is. It's just like, yeah, there's
Yeah.
a thing. It
Yeah.
just worked. So like, what's there to question? And things are more noticeable when there's more friction to them. But the rotisserie draft is a little bit unique from some of these other projects where if somebody's using the list formatter and it's like really helped them get their Mox field lists into Archidect, that's great, but I'm never going to see it. But I do occasionally see people on social media, here's my screenshot of, can you believe somebody took this in the rotisserie draft? And it's a pretty recognizable. I also tried to make the sheet look visually appealing and distinct. So I get to feel a little bit satisfying whenever I see that in the wild.
Now that you've put forward several tools that are all in really cool spots on the website, are there more that you're working on? Not to peek behind the curtain, but like, are there more things that you're working on? And what have you learned from what you've already done that you're applying forward?
Oof, there are already. I should have pulled up my list. There are so many things that I still want to work on. The biggest one that I've, like I mentioned, been spending a lot of time on in the last couple weeks is doing a little bit of analysis on how cubes are shuffled. So I actually wrote a little simulation to be able to say, well, if you just do the kind of typical way people do and kind of pass packs around the table and randomize things, how actually effective is that, and how long does it take to shuffle a cube? I know some people will do a structure where they'll pass half their packs left and sort of do that repeatedly as they're shuffling. And using that simulation, we can actually answer questions that are really difficult to answer when you're just looking at a bunch of face down piles of cards on a table. Finally, all the simulations are done and we're in the editing phase. So really, really happy to have Andy and Jet and Parker all looking at that and sort of giving their feedback on what does the actual presentation and sort of narrative of the article look like and does that make sense. But I am excited to see if that actually has an impact on the way that people shuffle cubes because I think we can just make it so much better, especially for events, just make it run a lot more smoothly.
It does seem like that's kind of a perennial conversation that comes up, almost the identical structure each time of, hey, how do you all shuffle a cube gets posted on some forum. And then there's about five
Yes.
default responses that come back, all touting some different way to approach it.
Absolutely. And I would love it if, unless somebody looks at my suggestion and says, this is actually not great, there's some pretty big flaws with this, hopefully it does turn out to be a pretty good solution. And the conversation can be much simplified by just, here it is, let me go point at this. That is kind of a funny thing about a lot of the articles I've written as well are pretty to the point. They're pretty just direct. It's not like a big flowery manifesto about the nature of games. It's more just like, hey, you want to do a rotisserie draft? Here's how it works. You want to build a set cube? Here's some ways you can do it. Which then I see people ask these questions in the Discord, and I want to be like, here it is. I already wrote this. I'm tired of writing this in Discord every time somebody asks a question. So I just put it in one canonical place, which doesn't feel as friendly. But my goal with all those kinds of very practical resources is just to make that information available.
Yeah, it's hard to not make it feel like don't make me tap the sign, but it's like, hey, no, this
Exactly.
is a
Yeah.
really helpful sign.
But to have the "Don't make me tap the shuffling" sign. I'm excited to have that URL to be able to drop.
So, as cube designers, it's easy to sometimes get lost in the heady theoretical tool-based technical space, but you also are a part of a pretty active regular cubing group, so you get to do a lot of the drafting side too.
Definitely. I mean, that's been another sort of rewarding aspect to the process of playing cube, and it's also been rewarding that our local group has developed in a way that's really, really awesome. And I really love the people that I play with and the way the group dynamic has grown and developed. And it's also been really exciting to be able to share that with other people through the podcast and legitimately see. I mean, I don't want to seem like I'm tooting my horn too much here, but the fact that we've come up with this process of just be consistent, show up every week, have a cube, accommodate whatever number of people, we've repeated that a lot on the podcast, and it has started really working for people, and that's super, super exciting. I mean, also to the point that I now visibly see it when I go to these more regional cube events that are coming up, and it's like, cool, you guys have your Tuesday night group, we have a Tuesday night group, you guys play every Thursday, and that's the thing I feel really proud to have sort of help shepherd along.
And it is really inspiring. I know it's something that a lot of people aspire to. They want to create something similar, and it's nice to have a marker of, hey, look, this can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of learning those lessons of it can happen, but it did take legitimately like, I don't know, 4 to 6 months before we actually had a regular 8 pod for our weekly cube group. And it was just a matter of, I am going to be here every single Tuesday. I will have a cube if nobody else is going to bring a cube, and we're going to draft something. And, the first month it was like, Sal and Luis, super glad you guys could be there. Occasionally we'd have a couple other people rolling in, but it just took a long time to get the word out. And those moments where somebody would show up and be like, yeah, I've heard about this a couple times over the last couple months, and I finally had a free Tuesday, so glad I could be here. Like, that was some really exciting sort of inflection points. And at this point, we fire 2 or 3 pods every Tuesday, and I have definitely made turned down my efforts to be advertising the group just because our LGS can't necessarily accommodate more than that. So as long as we're kind of in a stable state, I'm really, really happy with where things are with the group.
Good problems to have for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also in terms of, initially I was bringing the cube pretty much every week, but people have just gotten really excited about cube design. And whenever that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about when I really appreciate the culture we've developed, is that somebody will say, oh, I've just been designing this cube that's been showing up for a couple months, and everybody will be really enthusiastic about, we want you to bring your new cube and we're going to play it enthusiastically and give you the kind of feedback you're interested in, and not give you feedback if you're not interested in, and just be positive about it and excited about the people's creative projects.
Well, that's so exciting to have the different people bringing in their projects to be part of it. Does that mean, well, I guess it would necessarily mean that you get to draft your own cubes less frequently?
Which for me has honestly worked out great. I've been less excited. People that listen to Lucky Paper Radio will know reading the new cards coming out has not necessarily been the most exciting part of Magic for me right now. So the fact that the cube group has evolved in a way that I don't necessarily need to as much has just been perfect synergy.
So are you still building cubes these days?
I have a couple projects that are on the back burner. Every once in a while, I'll make some tweaks. I did make some big changes to both the regular cube and the turbo cube, which are the two I've sort of been still pretty involved with. The regular cube was my first cube, and I've carried that through my entire sort of cube career. So yeah, last October I made some pretty substantial changes, but yeah, I mean, honestly, doing every 6 months, even more disparate than that, larger updates, I think is a pace that I'm pretty comfortable with right now.
Well, to unpack one of those a little bit and to give us a ground to explore a few things here, let's talk about the regular cube and how you work with that these days.
So the regular cube, to come at this for maybe a little bit of a historical context, when I was first getting into cube, it was basically because my friend Andy, who I do the Lucky Paper Radio podcast with, saw LSV drafting cube on MTGO, and he was like, well, I've got a bunch of cards lying around. I want to do this. And so he went and followed kind of the typical spirit of the MTGO cube of just like, I'm going to play all the biggest splashiest, most exciting cards that I have. And it looked very different in a lot of individual cards because it was very much about working with the cards he had, not necessarily a bunch of legacy staples that he had, but maybe more commander things. But it was still very much in that spirit of the big, splashy, exciting, iconic cards. So that was the first cube in our play group, and we had fun with that. But I kind of wanted to try something pretty different because my main interest at that point in Magic was playing limited. That was just the format that I enjoyed the most. And I sometimes got a little bit frustrated playing Andy's cube, which he calls the Bun Magic Cube after our local playgroup, which is the Bun Magic Kitchen Table Pro Tour, because we
It's
were
such a good title.
it's so good. I think it was our friend Mark that came up with it, and it's just a great name. It's because we played a lot at the Bun Shop, which is just a store that sells buns, and we played kitchen table magic, but with a sort of intensity.
It's like we're talking like sticky buns, like actual like
Sticky
bread
buns,
products.
savory buns, they're just their specialty is buns, but within that spectrum they play.
I did not realize it was actually attached to the food item.
It is.
That's
So
so
yeah,
good.
Andy had the Bun Magic Cube after the playgroup, and I wanted to do something pretty different. And I was looking at Cube and just thinking of this is a custom draft format. You can include whatever cards you want. That means as I'm trying to play Commander over here, and I really want to play with these kinds of cards that are maybe a little bit jankier and don't really make sense, but somebody else is going to show up with this finely tuned, optimized deck, and it just makes these cards look kind of stupid, so it doesn't make sense. But here, if we're playing Cube, I can just put all of the cards that I want that are kind of balanced together and make legitimately whatever cards that I want to play with also feel functional and make sense. To steal a term from Zach Barish, have all of the cards within that cube in dialogue with each other in a way that they aren't in a constructed format, even a casual constructed format like Cube.
Yeah.
So I designed my cube to be playing with the kinds of cards that I enjoyed, which were more just like, little bears with upside that I enjoy playing with in limited, and make an environment that's all about playing creatures, playing to the board, finding nuances and small edges in combat, and really focusing on that kind of gameplay. But because I felt like I was very much playing within the bounds of what I thought Cube was, it's not like I was going out and doing something crazy and building this thematic cube or this mono green cube. It's like, no, this is my cube and it's just a regular cube. So it was a little bit sort of trying to push back against the established way that people talked about Cube, which was this is just where you play only the best cards, because I saw such an opportunity for it to be the place where you play with whatever cards you want. The Cube has evolved a lot. That very first time we played it, the gameplay did not reflect what I wanted it to be. The best decks were 5 colors and looping weird things with Archaeomancer or Wall of Omens or Wall of, what is it called? Demonic Wall.
Yeah, mnemonic wall. Yeah.
I Plenty of matches did not finish their game one, or maybe we were just there till midnight. I don't know. It was not perfect. My first shot was not on target, and that's normal. Like I shouldn't have expected it to be.
Well, you know that some people are salivating at that idea of just looping archaeomancers.
Oh no! I remember the face that James had when he did this, and he was having fun. So it took a lot of iteration. I mean, there were especially some areas that were more difficult. I didn't necessarily want green, for example, to be the big ramp strategy that it was in a lot of higher powered cubes, and figuring out how to give it a different identity that still made sense, that was still fun to play. It took a lot of iteration. And there's still a couple areas where things feel not totally resolved. Like blue green is still a bit weird, but people kind of just don't really draft it, and that's fine. Although I will say in the last draft, a blue green deck did 3-0, so maybe
Hey, there you
that's it.
go.
Maybe now the regular cube is actually done. Um,
It's finished. It's solved. You've done it.
it certainly feels, I wouldn't say it's ever solved, but it feels asymptotic. It's sort of reached a comfortable state where I'm not necessarily interested in really shaking things up. So I think to answer your previous question of am I working on other cubes? Yeah, there's some other things in the back burner, and mostly they're more just like ideas of what if I want to create a very different gameplay? What if I do want to lean into that kind of more grindy looping stuff? And some of what I've been thinking about is more about how do I change the expectations that I would maybe introduce a different cube to somebody and say like, hey, here's this cube where we're only going to get 2 rounds done tonight because the shop's going to close. But these are the kinds of games you should expect.
I think there's a value in having that kind of diversity in your own portfolio. Like here's a thing that I like that's kind of stable and perhaps grounded in a way, and here's something that's grounded in something completely different.
Totally. I mean, and we could also talk about the Turbo Cube, which is completely the opposite of the regular cube. It's not about any of that kind of gameplay of playing a bunch of creatures and focusing on how to get little edges in combat. It's about doing weird, crazy combos. Everybody's playing Storm all the time or trying to play against Storm.
Yeah, and just for the clarity there, Turbo Cube is your cube where each player has an emblem that all spells and activated abilities cost 2 generic mana less to cast or activate.
Exactly. And this cube actually kind of started out as a joke. I think especially when what is the card from Modern Horizons 1 or 2? It must have been 1 because it's icy. It just costs 1 snow mana and taps for any color.
Oh, Arkham's Astrolabe?
Arkham's Astrolabe. Everybody was so excited about that card, and I was like, Prophetic Prism already exists. Like, is this card really that novel? People just get really,
Yeah.
really excited about smaller numbers appearing on a card.
Yeah,
And
1 is not 2, it turns out.
they are very different numbers, but
I would assume you would know this as a programmer.
no, 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 no. See, I know X and Y and the specific numbers. The computer can deal with that. I was definitely still in this sort of headspace of like, no, like the numbers don't actually matter in a vacuum. Like I can't just look at one card and be like, ooh, this says 7. Isn't that great? It's only because 7 compares to your life total, which is 20, or the mana
Yeah.
cost of some other card. Like the numbers only make sense when you compare them within one game system. But people that are just really, really entrenched in that game system see a smaller number that is really meaningful to them because they're like, that's the smallest number I've seen in this kind of card before. And so my thought was just, well, if people just really like playing with power, they like playing with these cards that are extremely broken, what if we just steal this idea from Arena? They did a Turbo Cube draft, I think, of Ikoria, and just make everything power. If you think that Arkham's Astrolabe is objectively cooler than Prophetic Prism, how about we make it a 0 mana Prophetic Prism? Is that more fun?
You crank the dial all the way to 11, or I guess to 2 in this case.
All the way to 2, and in fact, the numbers are all relative, so we could just keep cranking it. Um, but it turned out, sort of to my chagrin, that it was actually pretty fun, and it wasn't necessarily what I was expecting because I was not setting out to build the all storm cube. I was setting out to build the cube where, oh, you thought Goblin Guide was cool? What if your Goblin Guide has 4 power instead and also makes a token and does all this crazy stuff that happens if you chop 2 mana off of your 3 mana Goblin Rabble Master? But it turned out to be something kind of interesting, and there was a very different iteration process of just trying to home in on what those interesting things were and how do we still give people space to make meaningful decisions about drafting in this very bizarre environment.
With the Turbo Cube in mind, do you think there's more space for cubes like that? Or does it feel like you've kind of hit the, hey, we're in the novelty space. We've kind of done the weird stuff. Now we need to go find a different lane.
So I think that there is a tremendous amount of space to explore in the weird novelties area, but I hate that I'm saying that out loud in a podcast because I think that there is equally as much space in just how do you build novel cubes by taking the regular cube approach of just building with the 30,000 cards that exist in a regular way. So I think that a lot of the novelty cube value is more in just that it has a very clear hook. You can say to somebody, here's the cube where everything costs 2 less, and start to sort of see the gears turning of like, oh, well, that means I can do this, and all these cards are going to be super efficient, and what happens with this kind of card? And if I just say, well, here's my cube, it is just a bunch of cards that I thought were interesting that otherwise aren't really getting played, that's really hard to get people excited about in the same way. Or maybe not even excited is maybe not even the right word, but set people's expectations in a way that brings them in.
Yeah, is that like a marketing challenge or is it more of just a like an appetite challenge for players?
Ooh, I think that you could think about it as a marketing challenge for sure, and it makes sense that way. But I like the idea of calling it an appetite challenge more about like how do I put something on the menu that people are going to gravitate to? And in our local play group, I literally built a website that is the cube menu that just lists here's all the cubes that we have in our local play group. And if somebody is new, they might be like, "Ooh, I saw this in the menu. Can we get that in the rotation in the next couple weeks?" So yeah, I like framing it in this more just like friendly, how do you make something appetizing to people?
Have you found that anybody in your play group has done that particularly well where they're able to frame something in a way that people are interested to try it even if it doesn't become a forever flavor?
I mean, we could definitely just go to the 100 Ornithopters cube is pretty well known at this point, but like it is not a novelty cube in the same way that the Turbo cube is, but it's funny how that cube has been so surprisingly approachable to people of different skill levels because it just not only has a clear hook to make it appealing, it has a clear hook to the gameplay as well, where you're like, okay, the only creatures have 0 power. How do I win? And that just gives people something to sink their teeth into and try and find a strategy where even in the regular cube, it's a little bit more difficult because there aren't necessarily super clear signposts. There's a couple cubes in our local group that are very much focused on the graveyard and making everybody's favorite graveyard synergies work, like the compost cube or the Ark. Our friend Alex built this cube where there are 2 of every card from every single set included in the cube. So it's sort of, on one hand, it's a fun cube to play, but it's also kind of a fun journey to see cards that span really fully the entire breadth of the history of the game. Or he also has a cube called the Oldest School, which is that's sort of a funny pattern I hadn't thought about of cubes being designed in antithesis to Andy's cube. But this is all of the cards that are too bad to be played in his neoclassical cube. And the headline is Shivan Dragon. And it's like, this is the cube where Shivan Dragon is a great card. And that gets people excited.
Yeah, shout out to Brett who made the rent controlled cube as well.
Oh yeah, that's a similar space.
It is funny though to think of how many of those designs are against Andy somehow.
Coming up with a new podcast called Against Andy, but it's a nice thing. Yeah, I mean the Fire Swamp is also a really great example. This is Brett's cube, which I got a chance to play at last CubeCon, and I think the way that the narrative of this is all about the Fire Swamp, it's like not representing a full and balanced picture of the color pie. It's focused on certain aspects and it's focused on grotesqueness and violence and being spooked. Actually, really just pans out in the gameplay. So I think that's a really good example of an effective cube that is still in the space of a normal cube.
I wonder if for a cube like your Turbo Cube or for the 100 Ornithopters, or maybe even something like the Fire Swamp when it's not being played at a large cube event, do you think that there's an appeal to it when there's not as much emphasis on the outcome or on like your results or your record at the end of it? Like people would be more interested to play or to try these things when it doesn't matter whether you win or lose.
People do still want to win at their weekly cube night. It's still
Sure.
always more fun when you're winning. But I think this is another aspect of going back to sort of that culture that I think has been cultivated in our local group, and I see it in a lot of other local groups as well, where once you sort of get into this groove of, oh, I get to just draft people's cubes for free every week, and it's just something like new and weird to explore, then people have really gotten into like just set the expectation that this is just going to be something fun to explore, and it might be pretty different from what I'm used to, but the stakes couldn't be lower, so that's fine.
Yeah, and I want to be careful to not imply that winning is not important or valuable to some people, more just that it's not you're not looking for an environment that you have to necessarily optimize to have a good time with.
For sure. There's no trophy pin on the line, which, as we all know, is the really important thing at these events.
How many of those do you have now?
One, two, three, four, five, seven trophy pins.
Amazing. Amazing. Thinking about your design journey with your own cubes and then as you've engaged with Lucky Paper throughout the process, do you feel pressure as somebody who's in this place of some measure of prominence in the community, like to curate your cubes in any particular way?
You know, that's a difficult question, and this sort of idea of yeah, how do things change when you become a known person? It's definitely been a little bit weird. Like we had a moment we were at Steel City Cube and Andy made some like small offhanded joke that you would only get if you're a listener to the podcast, and there were Snickers all around the room, and there was sort of this moment of realization like, oh, I've just been like hanging out having a conversation with the person across the table from me, but like half this room knows who I am, which is kind of a bizarre kind of thing to realize. I think as far as my cube designs, it hasn't necessarily put a lot of pressure or change on it. Like I still want to make clear that these are just the cubes that I'm making, and if other people want to clone them, use them, they should do that, but I want to make sure it's still framed as I'm just some guy. These are not like be all end all high things that are worth putting on a pedestal. So I think maybe that's the thing that I would be most emphatic about is Yeah, don't put these on a pedestal. Let me just like set expectations appropriately. I think also maybe it's different for just the way that myself and some other people that are doing podcasts and things talk about things, that I'm always very willing to put a lot of caveats, or I'm just curious about things. I'm not about to put a lot of strong statements out there. That doesn't mean I get a lot of focused criticism in the same way. So I don't know. I think that it definitely puts some interesting pressures on it, but it hasn't necessarily altered my way that interact with playing Cube in a huge way. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's still your cube. Like, it's not
Yeah.
something you're building for the broader community necessarily.
Yeah, and I've heard some cube designers that are also doing podcasts. They do put a lot more emphasis on that, and they think about, this is a cube that has some prominence now. People are cloning it and playing it and using it, and for that reason, they want to be like really respectful to those people and make sure that they are given a good experience and they don't just like change up the cube wildly. And honestly, I've felt more of that pressure in the past. I think especially before CubeCon 1, the idea of here's my little cube that I've been playing with my local play group, and it's now going to go to an event where potentially 8 like really talented, successful players are going to have this in their hands, and I don't want to see it like torn to shreds and just be like, "Oh yeah, the only effective way to draft this cube is play green white." That would be my dream, obviously, but
Yeah, well, of course, of course.
just play green white. None of the other cards matter. Removal's bad, so just ignore that. Like I definitely was scared that it just wouldn't work. And then after that first CubeCon, it was so clear that, oh yeah, people are just playing this once for the first time. It's extremely hard to like break a format in a single draft, and it's new for everybody, so it's going to be a fun novel experience, even if it isn't necessarily a cube that would remain fun. If you took the Magic Pro League and just had them grind the same cube for a month, like, yeah, it wouldn't stand up. I'm sure it would not, but that's just not what these events are. So it's taken me a little bit of time to be more comfortable with just, this is my cube, it's the best I can do for now, it's based on my experience, both in the sense that it is only good up to this point, or it only has this experience to build off of. But some of my experience has also been that we played with the card a bunch of times and I'm just kind of tired of it. We've seen it enough, so I'm going to cut it. So if you still like that card that I have cut, it doesn't mean that I know something about why that card doesn't fit. And therefore, if you want to add it back in, it doesn't make sense. It's that I'm just playing this cube from a different context where I've seen that card enough. So yeah, I feel like it's taken me a while to take a little bit of pressure off myself in some of those ways.
Hmm. And I'm thinking some of what I believe Zach Barish said on your show not too long ago, and other people have suggested this too, where you can't really know your own cube. Even drafting it dozens and dozens of times, how do we get any actionable data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even find that often, as far as like win percentage, cube owners sometimes struggle playing with their own cube. And I think a lot of that is just because they are seeing the paths that they built in there. And maybe the desire paths that cut across what they're trying to do are actually the optimal things to be doing. And people that are coming to it with a fresh mind are just more likely to not sort of be tainted by those expectations.
I don't know if you're familiar with Andrew Bird, the music artist.
Oh, absolutely.
One of my coworkers' very favorites. One of his album titles that sticks in my brain is "My Best Work So Far."
Quick editing booth correction. My finest work yet.
Perfect.
And I love that was how you described that, as like, hey, this is the best I can do for now, and that just rattled around in my brain of like, I think that's a really healthy way to consider anywhere we are on our cube journey. Is like, hey, this is where I am right now, and this is something to be celebrated.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense in the context of music as well, where it's like it's not just the best work he's done so far, but it's also the work that is interesting at this moment. And maybe some other song he's sung in the past has been delightful and enjoyable, but he's just sung that song enough times and wants to do something a little bit different.
Yeah, yeah. So, what are you most excited about in the cube space right now?
I mean, my brain is just so messed up by thinking about shuffling for the last 2 weeks that it's kind of hard for me to think about, but really just looking back on this year at all these projects I've been doing on the web, and also, building the website for the local community, building the website for the event that's coming up in Baltimore, building little emblems for my cubes like that, just actually doing some little creative projects. All of these things that kind of are influenced by Magic. I wouldn't be doing them if I wasn't doing Magic, but then let me think about doing some data visualization, building some interactive user interfaces, stuff like that. It's those intersections that really are very satisfying to me. Or the intersection with cooking, being able to host a cube night and also cook dinner for everybody is something that I really enjoy doing. And it would be harder to do that potentially if I didn't necessarily have Cube to be that kind of connective tissue to hold some of these projects together. Another project, yeah, you asked earlier about what's sort of next in terms of resources I want to build for Lucky Paper. Something that's been on the back burner for so long is just, can we make kind of a canonical resource that is the introduction to Cube? You know, you're somebody
Mm.
that just heard about Cube somewhere and you're like, what's this all about? And building something that is, I say building something, I mean, it's an article that would be an effective entry point that would both show you the breadth of how big it can be, but in a very concise way that is not intimidating and actually just sort of opens some doors to point you in some directions. And it's really hard to both be brief about that while being thorough enough. So I've tried to write this article a couple times and failed, but maybe it's time for me to revisit that again.
I mean, yeah, how do you maintain appropriate passion and be incredibly succinct on something so broad?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and literally, I tried to write this article and I was like, no, you know what? Set cubes could be its whole other article. I'm just going to write that article and then we'll just link to it so we can just mention it briefly. So I think there were like 5 other articles that I ended up writing an entire full article based on wanting to put a small mention of it in this like larger, more comprehensive introductory piece. So it's not like that still hasn't gone somewhere, but yeah, just creating that really effective entry point has been a challenge.
And I know you've found joy in several different creative pursuits. So why cube?
Cube really was the most logical way for me to interact with Magic after every other way that I had played with it. I mean, I started with very much kitchen table Magic, played a lot of Commander, and I liked Commander because I liked to be able to ostensibly play with the cards that I wanted and build cards that were very thematic, and it was a little bit more casual. And then I really got into Limited because I got frustrated with the gameplay of Commander. Like I was just not having fun with it, and I thought, okay, well, if we can actually just play one on one and do so in a way that is still very exploratory and challenging, I honestly never got into Constructed because the idea of I'm just going to go net deck or I will not net deck and I will lose was not a exciting sort of choice of options. So Limited fell in the space that was still trying to make the most from imperfect resources and make decisions on the fly that I felt was really satisfying. But it is also constrained to here's the new set and you have to learn it and there's like a life cycle to it, and that life cycle honestly just kind of died in the pandemic for me locally. So Cube has been this thing that both takes what I love about Commander and I can play with any cards that I want, but I can actually then try and play optimally with those cards in a way that doesn't consume itself and end up cannibalizing the format and create this arms race that destroys itself. Cube is also great for me right now because again, you know, the pace of products coming out is quicker than I want to keep up with, and that's fine. You know, if I'm playing standard, I can't skip a new set and just be like, I'm gonna keep playing the same deck and hope it still does okay. I'm gonna lose. Lose in a way that just will not make my games meaningful, right? But if I don't update my cube for a couple sets, no problem. It's still, you take it off the shelf and it still plays just as well as it did. So for all of these reasons and the fact that it also just has so many more opportunities to do these other creative projects that branch off of it, it's hard for me to imagine me still playing Magic any other way right now.
Well, Anthony, as we trend toward wrap up here, if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would you pick and who would you have do the illustration?
Okay, so I dreaded this question. To anybody who knows me, I mean, as I already mentioned, I am not somebody who likes to make clear hyperbolic statements, or even maybe that's too precise. I don't like to make a choice. I don't want to choose a favorite. It's like I like the variety and breadth. Um,
It's like going to the restaurant. I'll have what you're having, I guess.
yeah, sure. Just like I don't know how to use this menu. Like you're the cook, you know what's best, right? Like I don't know. When people come to me and they say I want my website and I want it done this way, I'm like, well, maybe you should ask me how to do it because that's what I'm actually an expert in. There's a lot more nuance to that. Um, so I was a little bit dreading this question until I realized that there's actually a very easy answer. There's one card that I love to play with. I was even thinking about this. I was like, you know what? Maybe I'm just going to put 2 copies of this in all my cubes. But the illustration just doesn't do it justice, which is Chromatic Star. It's such a beautiful little card. It just fuels a bunch of little synergies. You might include it just because you need a little bit more mana fixing, but then you end up caring about artifacts or sacrificing things or card draw or filling up the graveyard. It's just such a great little glue card. And the illustration is just, I have to say, not great. It's actually one of my favorite things to do on Scryfall is if I find a card that I think has an interesting illustration, I'll click on that artist and then add a couple more parameters to the search bar. So I'll add new art, order, date, and direction ascending, and just look at an artist's entire body of work as they've been making Magic cards. And it's so fun to see how every artist kind of has their own trend and changes. And I'm looking through Alex Horley Alandori's sort of body of work in order, and it's like, yeah, you can sort of see his clear development, and he's refining his style and getting a little bit more detailed. And I'm like, oh well, I must have missed Chromatic Star. Clearly, that must have been one of the first ones. But no, it just kind of seems way out of place here in Time Spiral. It's like, okay, you kind of phone this one in. And there's a new illustration. It's not to my taste either. So
I mean, it is just a chromatic star.
it's just like the updated, what if we did a 3D rendering version of this and made it look a lot more polished, a lot more refined, but doesn't have a lot of soul either. So card, pretty easy. We got to get a promo of Chromatic Star so we can have nicer Chrome Star in our cubes. The choice of artist was more difficult because the people that I immediately went to, I love Chippy, especially some of his early work is really great. Robert Bliss is a short-lived artist for reasons, but like Goblin Soothsayer is just such a fantastic card. Kev Walker, I know Rebecca Gay gets referenced every episode, so I got to do that. But I didn't think that any of these artists were necessarily the best specifically for an artifact. I mean, like I'm looking at with Alex's work on the original Chromatic Star. He does some incredible work. Some of my favorite cards are in here, but just drawing a little dinky guy, little object, is not necessarily in his wheelhouse. He actually is good at little guys. Little guys. Just not at little object guys, little crystal guys. So what I did, my strategy was, I again went by, let's look at all the artifacts with new art printed by release date and just scroll through all the artifacts and find out who is the right person to do the Chromatic Star promo. And I came up with two answers. I think Mark Tadine has just done so many great objects, and he has, especially some of his newer work, it's just highly textured, really interesting, even with things that seem kind of mundane. He does really, really beautiful work. And then Richard Kane Ferguson also came to mind. Again, just like taking something that's just a staff, but it's going to be this rich texture and tapestry of color. And I think, that's obviously very appropriate for Chromatic Star. So if I could, as the art director, get a sketch from each of these artists and then just see what direction we felt more comfortable with after that, that would be my choice. I would be shocked if Richard Kane Ferguson would actually do a sketch. I think he would just be like, I'm going to go in my garage and spray paint around and see what happens. But in an ideal world, that would be my choice, is one of those two.
I think my favorite part of this answer, Anthony, is that you led with, hey, I was dreading this question, and then you came prepared with a full dissertation on how you landed here. That's delightful.
It's sometimes it's just about finding a process to attack a problem. And in this case, it was looking through a lot of cards sorted by release date and looking at trends in illustration style.
Maybe there's a tool that can be made for this.
If only.
If only. Well, Anthony, this has been a delight to chat through so many things with you. Certainly, there are many directions that we can point folks to follow up on more of your work, particularly on your cubes. There are probably no fewer than a half dozen episodes that cover your projects in different ways. There are all sorts of great articles you've written, the tools that you have on luckypaper.co. Are there any other places that we should point people to help them get connected if they want to follow up?
Those are the main places. I think if you're interested in some of the tools that we talked about, specifically the resources page, which is in the main navigation on the Lucky Paper site, is where to find those. Some of them are also maybe just linked on GitHub, but they will be referenced on that page. We also might be redesigning that in the future a little bit to make it easier to navigate. I'm also on Blue Sky since other websites have imploded, so I'm just anthony.luckypaper.co there, and I've been tweeting or posting whatever about I'll post there about new articles or tools that I end up publishing, as well as stuff that I'm cooking, because that's what I enjoy doing. And if you are in the MTG Cube Talk Discord or a lot of the other Cube Discords, I'll be around as well. And if you have questions, stuff you want to talk about, feel free to reach out to me there.
Well, I so appreciate your expertise and your passion and frankly your friendship. I've been grateful for getting to hear your lead on the Lucky Paper radio podcast, and just getting to share this moment here has been really special for me. So thank you for taking the time to be part of it.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Cade. It's been a delight. Again, I've really been enjoying the episodes. I think especially the recent episodes with Arlo and with Roja were just honestly some of my favorite conversations I've had the chance to listen to about Cube, similar to what we've been talking about. They start talking about Cube, but then they go off talking about issues of identity and imposter syndrome and how they approach different types of communities differently and what it feels like to be joining a community where maybe they've had struggles. And there's just so much in there that I just really, really appreciated and valued from both those interviews. So I would go check those out if you haven't. And I would also just thank you, Cade, for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
Oh my goodness. Well, Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
And on that bombshell,
I would say
and then what do you say? I don't know.